And so this is a new lecture in our Takoma Park Arts series. We do lectures, poetry readings, film screenings, concerts. Everything's free, and so you can get more info at takomaparkmd.gov/arts, or you can sign up for our e-newsletter out in the lobby. So we're excited to have University of Maryland history professor Richard Bell here tonight to talk about the Reverse Underground Railroad. We're going to have a Q&A when he's done, and then he'll also be selling some books over here. I'm sure he'll sign them for you if you're interested. So thanks again for coming, and here's Richard.
Hello, folks. It is nice to see you in real life, which is something I didn't used to take for granted when giving talks about my research and scholarship, but have started to realize that was a grave mistake. Brendan, who I met for the first time in the flesh in real life tonight, he and I have been emailing for about 2.5 years. Try and guess why it's taken so long to pull this event together. We planned this event for, I think, March 20th of 2020, and we all know what happened next. So thanks to Brendan for this invitation. Did you hear that Brendan is the Arts and Humanities Coordinator for Takoma Park? How many cities around the world have an Arts and Humanities Coordinator? That is a wonderful sign of the priorities of this community. We are all increasingly aware of the value of humanities, arts, and civic education in this country, and the importance of protecting that. So it's really great to see a city put its tax dollars to use to manifest that priority, among others. So thank you for having me here. As you heard, I'm going to talk about this new research on something I call the Reverse Underground Railroad for about 35 minutes or so, then take any questions or comments and have a discussion in real life with all of you. I hope that sounds okay. And thanks to John in the tech booth for making this happen as well. This is obviously serious stuff, folks. Let's not make any bones about this. Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old, and he was trapped. He was stuck, he was locked in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like the one on the screen, a small ship that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old boy from a spot near Philadelphia's market an hour ago, shoved a black gag into his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him aboard. It was dark below the ship's waterline. But Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down there. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him, 4 other African-American boys. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were smaller. I'll start that again. 2 more were taller, in fact, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was smaller and shorter than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free. Like you, like me. But today they were enslaved. They were prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his friends or his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August of 1825, and he was one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, the city of brotherly love was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Philadelphia's gridded streets, Philadelphia's tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. And they did their work swiftly and shamelessly. in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation, not only as the city of brotherly love, but as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of America's anti-slavery movement. But of course, to kidnappers, none of that stuff mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And this was a product of its location. I know none of us need to be reminded where Philadelphia is with a giant orange arrow, but maps are always useful teaching tools. Philadelphia, as all of you know, was the nearest major free city on the East Coast to the slave South at that time in American history. Philadelphia lay just, 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, one of which we're in right now. As Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary line between the orange and the green had become ever more important, especially for black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, that Mason-Dixon line seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free soil states from southern slave states. And Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made its many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states. They preyed on members of that city's free black community relentlessly. They put bullseyes on their backs. They put prices on their heads. And the people they stole away from liberty could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Three of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton, and they would take almost anyone to do that work. Buying a small percentage of their forced laborers from kidnappers of free black Americans was not likely their first choice, but their options were circumscribed. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808. That was the year that lawmakers in Washington had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them here. That 1808 decision's not very famous in the big scheme of things, but it should be, because that 1808 decision in Washington was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America. A turning point that would spur the growth of an American slave trade, an internal slave trade, a domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the US tried to satisfy these southwestern settlers' demands for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia and Delaware that were in surplus, where there were some planters willing to sell a small proportion of the enslaved people they owned for fat profits. That was all legal, of course, and it was big business. Scholars tell us that about 1 million African Americans were sold and forcibly transported from places like Maryland to places like Mississippi in the early 1800s, before the Civil War. It's called the domestic slave trade, and it's enormous business, and it's wholly legal. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more. And the stronger the demand, the more tempting and the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children, like Cornelius, from northern cities like Philadelphia, launder them into that legal supply chain I just described and then sell them in this vast new southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of a nationwide kidnapping operation. It had become the largest northern depot of something I call in my research America's reverse Underground Railroad. So when I use that phrase tonight, the reverse Underground Railroad, I'm talking about what I just described, the kidnapping of northern free black people for the purpose of selling them into slavery, usually in the Deep South, America's reverse Underground Railroad. And this reverse Underground Railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they ran in opposite directions, right? And they existed for very different purposes, of course. But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of each other. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one, about which I'm happy to answer any questions tonight. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek usually northwards, dreaming of new lives and new opportunities in freedom. But on America's reverse Underground Railroad, free black people were stolen from northern cities like Philadelphia and were made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their lives and their liberty to help black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated by money. These two networks, one obviously heroic and courageous, the other obviously evil and monstrous, these two networks roared to life at the same time in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North versus the South. Both networks, one good, one bad, were loosely organized and opportunistic. Both ran on secrecy. Both relied on small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, false identities, even disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes, taken by freedom seekers going north and by victims of kidnapping made to go south, the routes were often the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was also roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of black adults and children across state lines, half of them towards freedom, half of them towards slavery. Most Americans know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad by now. Historians have spent decades studying the strategies and the tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. The achievements of these American heroes now command our attention. And there are Underground Railroad walking tours and television shows and museums, and of course the recent movie Harriet. This was the last movie I saw in a theater before the pandemic. Maybe it was for you too. All of this stuff is dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. But I think we know far less about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even today. They certainly never gave public lectures about their criminal activity. They never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely Do their names and crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts? Their low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the years these kidnappers spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, protected by too much indifference and apathy among ordinary Americans who knew what they were up to and did nothing to stop them. The outlaws who built America's reverse underground railroad left no business records. They left no bundles of private letters for historians to read and examine in the Library of Congress. Kidnappers don't write memoirs. Kidnappers don't pose for paintings or photographs, which left journalists and activists at the time to guess, as you see here, at what they might have looked like. This is not a photograph. Someone is guessing here. But as I argue in my recent book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in the book begins, but about every northern town or city with a free black population, if we think not just about 1825, when the true story I tell in the book begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse underground railroad stole away from liberty likely tens of thousands of free black people, many of them children like Cornelius who were under the age of 16. And let me be super clear here. Most of those they kidnapped away from freedom were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched frantically for them, of course. They would lobby, they would petition, they would advertise, they would wait in earnest for any good news, but usually nothing came back. Free black people in northern cities like Philadelphia had very few white allies in this period of American history, beyond the ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, while city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white upon black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates or policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, search property, or interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews, they knew exactly what to do, they knew exactly what to say, to talk their way out of trouble, and to get back to work. We won't do a show of hands, but I'm guessing all of you here have heard of 12 Years a Slave. Oscars are this weekend, by the way. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie which won Best Picture at the Oscars that was based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northup, who of course was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse underground railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Northup later escaped Southern slavery. Remember, it took him 12 years to do it, but he did it. And then he returned home, and then he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which Northup wrote in 1853, he explains what riding America's reverse underground railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed, white con men lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Northup was a well-educated, prosperous musician, literate too, and in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, those con men wined him and dined him, and if you remember the movie, they drugged him, and then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northup was soon forced onto a slave ship that was bound for New Orleans, and there he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his cane fields. In 2013, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to his ordeal. But both the memoir and the movie offer, I think, misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. It turns out, folks, that Solomon Northup's experience on America's reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. The railroad's kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. No. They preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with tricks and lies that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on foot in small, specialized overland convoys known as coffles. And their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. No, they were vastly more likely to be sold off along the way, in ones or twos, in furtive all-cash deals, to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or the interior of Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more human beings, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Alex and Enos and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto a ship just outside Philadelphia, which you can see in the top right of the map. Their captors warehoused them for a week or two in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line, just above the word Nanticoke at the bottom of the screen. And then they kept going. Then they marched them, these 5 children, halfway across this vast continent towards the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 of them as slaves. This was a soul-destroying journey. If you put one foot in front of the other, you'll do that 2 million times on this route. It's a journey of 2 million human footsteps. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass over much of the experience the boys endured on that route. Likewise, my publisher insists that I pass over much of the book's second half, in which we learn that some, but not all, of these 5 boys make a miraculous escape and begin the astonishing Odyssey home to Philadelphia, referred to in the book's subtitle. All I will say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen next was indeed astonishing to them, to the people around them, and to me. It would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the earth, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. Instead of breaking my promise and telling you everything that happens in this book, the publisher wants you to buy it. Let me just quickly note that, and you can find it in the library, by the way, I don't mind. Let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next is a story that's never before been told, and for understandable reasons. Cornelius was a kid at the time. He came from a hard-up family that was not the sort to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that's a problem, because this is a true story. It's history. I made up none of this. And historians like me need sources, lots of them, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true and fair. The stories and the struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers and diaries and memoirs often remain untold and unstudied as a result of the lack of readily available evidence. So what do you do? Well, to reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from this man. This is Joseph Watson. He was the mayor of Philadelphia at the time, and he belatedly wades into this story, almost too late. But his letters survive because he was rich, white, and powerful. And we also have coverage of Cornelius's case in a single anti-slavery magazine from the era. Now, to be clear, historians have known about these modest sources for some time. But on their own, they turn out to be too few and too thin to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing Odyssey into and out of slavery. So in addition to these sources, I've had to go looking elsewhere, of course. And that's meant digging around in any archive I could find for scraps of other information that, when stitched together, could help sort of flesh this all out. And of course, along the way, there's been a lot of days spent finding nothing at all, looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only lots and lots of hay. If you've done your own historical or genealogical research, I'm sure that's a familiar sensation to you. But if you keep at it, you usually find something. And for me, it's ultimately certainly been worth it. Over 6 years of research for this book, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles buried in all those haystacks, which is to say, new sources about this particular case, buried within, I think, 35 archives in 14 states and the District of Columbia. This was when you could get on planes and travel around. The good news is I'm not going to list all the sources I found, but I would have mentioned 3 of them really quick to give you a flavor. Among the things I found were the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial which would decide the fate of one of these 5 boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered something I thought could not exist. I found 2 letters authored by one of the kidnappers in which the kidnapper names his accomplices in this gang and describes their role in this specific kidnapping, one of dozens in which he participated. A mind-blowing find. You would think I made that up. It's in the back of the book if you want to see it. And most affectingly of all, at least for me, I found this. This is a missing persons notice put in a local paper by Cornelius's grieving father. It's short, so we can read it. It says, "Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, it's feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout-built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than the right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair." I've read this missing persons notice hundreds and hundreds of times in my life in the course of the research for this book. And every time the same 2 words on the screen jump out at me like they're written in neon, like they're 7 foot high: afflicted parents. All of us are born to parents. Many of us are parents to children. I have a 5.5-year-old and an 8.5-year-old. The thought that my children could be taken from me and there'd be nothing I could do to get them back. I can't even put that into words. Joseph is trying and struggling here. Afflicted parents. It's the understatement of the 19th century. So before I turn to you for some questions and comments in a minute or two, let me wrap up with a couple of brief reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that black lives have always mattered, and so any true story about free children being ripped from their families and swallowed up by American slavery is a story worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention, I think, for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities, and black freedom was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I said, I'm not going to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half, or tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. I want you to read the thing. But in case you don't, I'll drop a few big hints right here. And I will say here that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save him and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize black communities across the Free Soil states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists, like the 2 women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet, to focus the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of black families being forcibly separated by kidnappers, by slave catchers, by slave traders, by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping statute known as a personal liberty law. That 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage Southerners and slaveholders more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War, and set in motion a chain of court challenges to it and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this country on a collision course with civil war. So to conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him, and the things that he and the other boys made happen next, would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy must never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. In 1825, a 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery, they would have to fight like hell to try to escape. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard. That's really informative. So we'll do a Q&A. If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand and I'll pass the mic around. Maybe I'll open it up. I was curious, I had not heard of that 1808 law banning the international slave trade. What was the debate like about in Congress, and how did the North convince or overwhelm the southern states to go along with it?
What was the debate like in Congress? Have you ever listened to Congress debate things? Ever seen that on TV for 6 hours at a time? It's not always pretty. The decision, which was taken in 1806 and then enacted on the first day of 1808, to ban American importation of black people from overseas for the purposes of enslaving them in this country, was not taken for particularly noble reasons, unfortunately. It does not mark a sort of sign of a large number of congressmen and senators and the president at the time embracing the anti-slavery cause. For instance, the president who signed that law was Thomas Jefferson, who owned plenty of enslaved people at exactly that time. In fact, some of you may know that Jefferson writes all men are created equal in the Declaration, right? That's in 1776. When he dies 50 years later in 1826, he owns way more slaves after that. So Jefferson is never a paragon of anti-slavery principle. And that's true for many of the congressmen. They also own enslaved people, and many who don't have interests in the slave trade indirectly or directly. So the passage of this law is generally not regarded by historians as a sign of great anti-slavery principle. It comes down to a combination of factors, 2 of which are foreign, international, 1 of which is domestic. The domestic one is the one that I mentioned, that there are plantation owners in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia who've just stopped growing tobacco because the price has fallen out of the market and have started growing wheat and other cereals instead. And wheat and other cereals are far less labor intensive than tobacco, so they're looking to trim, or right size would be the modern management term, the number of enslaved people who do that labor for them. They're looking to sell some of their slaves, and they're looking for buyers, and they're looking down to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and they don't like having foreign imports as competition for that market. So that's one context, right, as to why Congress goes along with this. There are congressmen from our region who say this is great for our plantation owners. The other 2 contexts are international. The British government, under great pressure from grassroots anti-slavery activists in Britain, after 30 years of saying no, finally says yes to abolishing its role in the transatlantic slave trade. And if you know much about the transatlantic slave trade, you know that British shipping and infrastructure and financial systems had undergirded almost all of it for centuries. So with Britain opting out, that actually destroys the market for pretty much everyone. So America opting out is really just like seeing the writing on the wall. And then the other context, which is international, is the Haitian Revolution. I hope most of you have heard of the Haitian Revolution. It's really important. Began in 1791 in the French sugar island in the Caribbean of Saint-Domingue, where the enslaved people there rise up to claim their own liberty, to abolish slavery, to put themselves in charge. And unlike every other slave revolt in the New World up to that point, it works. They succeed. And they kick the French out, they abolish slavery, they put themselves in charge, and they create the independent Republic of Haiti, which is the name they choose. And that terrifies every white enslaver within 2,000 miles of Haiti. And so, given that many imports into the United States of enslaved people actually came from the Caribbean, not from Africa, people in the United States who own slaves get very terrified that if they're not careful, they will inadvertently be importing people with revolutionary ideas about freedom from the revolutionary Caribbean. So those are the 3 contexts. So the debate is rancorous, people are yelling and screaming, probably hitting each other. It's Congress on any given Tuesday, I think. Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to direct traffic? I'll let you direct
Sure,
traffic.
yeah.
Okay.
Would you say something about the other context, which was the clause in the Constitution?
Yeah, thank you. I did miss that, didn't I? The reason that the law is passed in 1806 but doesn't go into effect until January the 1st, 1808, is because the United States Constitution says you cannot touch American participation in the transatlantic slave trade until the 1st of January, 1808. There is a clause in the Constitution explicitly protecting American participation in the transatlantic slave trade between 1787, when the Constitution is drafted, all the way through the 1st of January 1808. So if George Washington had wanted to abolish American participation in the transatlantic slave trade in his administration in the early 1790s, he wouldn't have constitutionally been able to do it. John Adams, who probably did want to do that, couldn't do it. His hands were tied by the Constitution. Jefferson is the first president who's in the right year to even be able to have the power constitutionally to touch that. So that's an important reminder that the original 1787 Constitution is, according to almost every reputable scholar, a pro-slavery document. The Three-Fifths Compromise is the most famous example of its pro-slavery credentials. The second most famous explanation of that is the protection of the transatlantic slave trade clause. There are 7 others, so we could go on down that list. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of people know about the fugitives being hunted down and caught and brought back south. And I think you mentioned 1850. That was,
yeah, that's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
But I remember reading that in the starting in the 1830s, there was a lot of discussion about ending slavery and freeing the slaves, and I always thought that it was what they were doing with the fugitives that led to more sympathy for the slaves. But what you're describing is much worse, far worse.
Mm-hmm.
That free, mostly young people
Mm-hmm.
were just taken from the north to the south. So that, I don't understand why we don't know about that.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that comment and that question. So you're absolutely right that what I'm talking about, the kidnapping of free black people from northern towns and cities, often gets overshadowed by what we do hear about slave catchers chasing black fugitives who are trying to escape southern slavery by going to the north, and those catchers will drag them back. That's real, happened all the time. Lots of famous cases, for instance. Some of them better known than others. A case I want to write a book about one day is the first fugitive arrest case that occurred after the 1850 law, the famous fugitive slave law. It was a guy in New York, a fugitive from southern slavery, who's captured by a slave catcher and the slave catcher is granted the full support of the US government to drag him back to wherever it is. And that guy's name, the fugitive's name, is James Hamlet. And there's this most amazing engraving from an abolitionist writer at the time called, and the engraving is called Hamlet in Chains. And it's this black man with shackles on his thing being dragged back to slavery. It's a very evocative image, but fugitive cases like that happened all the time. And they do sort of overshadow what I'm talking about, which we can debate what's worse. It's all terrible, right? Which is the kidnapping of free black people into slavery. And of course, those kidnappers dearly wanted to be mistaken for slave catchers, because slave catchers have the full protection of the US government at their back. The 1850 law I mentioned is not the first one. It's just the most powerful one. The original Constitution has a fugitive slave clause in it, granting slave catchers the right to grab people. There's a 1793 fugitive slave law passed under Washington, I guess that would have been, trying to enforce that as well. 1850 is just the most famous. So kidnappers dearly want to be mistaken for legal slave catchers doing their legal work, and they exist in that sort of dark shadow area. So that's one of the reasons we don't know much about the kidnapping of free people. I think there's probably many other reasons that we could all speculate on. One is, I think that I'm a US citizen despite this British accent, just so we're super clear about that. that we in this country, I've lived here for 20 years, that we in this country often work in very simple binaries when we think about American history, good and bad, right? Heroes and villains, right? Cops and robbers. And so in our mind's eye, we always think of the North as the good guys, right? And the South as the bad guys. And that's a Civil War era sort of binary, right? But before the Civil War, it starts to break down. If you look at the rampant extent of white racism in northern towns and cities before the Civil War, then it's hard to say those guys are the good guys, and those are the guys standing by while watching their black community members get kidnapped under their noses and doing absolutely nothing. There's a white mayor in this story, you saw him on the screen, his name's Joseph Watson, who does do something, and he is the exception that proves the rule. He was the mayor of Philadelphia and he does something. But his predecessor in that job did absolutely nothing when confronted with similar evidence of kidnapping happening under his nose. His successor in that job, who went on to become a vice president of the US, did absolutely nothing when confronted with more evidence of that sort of thing happening. So the idea that everyone north of Maryland is blameless or lacking in complicity for everything that's happening south of Pennsylvania is, I think, fantasy a lot of the time, a convenient fantasy.
I can understand, regardless of how people felt about slavery, ignoring that, how could anybody actually defend kidnapping free blacks? Why was it controversial that Philadelphia passed this restriction?
Yeah, so kidnapping does not have any public defenders. The key words here are indifference and apathy, I think, which is different from proactive vocal support for kidnappers. Though on the fringes, there are people who will speak up publicly for kidnappers. Let me give you one example. Many of these kidnappers happen to be based in Delaware. They could just as easily be based in Maryland, but they happen to be based in Delaware. And in Delaware, there's only a couple of newspapers. One is called the American Watchman. And in 1817, you can find a letter to the editor of that newspaper by some local writer who says, "Oh my Lord, we've seen a lot of kidnappings of free black people from Delaware and surrounding states in recent months. And I've got to tell you, if we could find the people doing this stuff, the kidnappers, if we could get their names and addresses, then we'd be able to organize a 5-year tax break for them to reward them for the great service they're doing to the state of Delaware by removing this criminal element, and the criminal element of the free black people in this guy's mind, right? So there are people on the fringes who will speak up, but otherwise it's about not doing anything. It's about looking the other way, which of course is the way that white supremacy thrives and grows, right? It thrives and grows by people saying it doesn't exist or it doesn't matter or it's not a big deal. And so,
But you said there was hostility toward it. You didn't say there was apathy.
Hostility towards what, to make me understand?
To Philadelphia's rule.
Oh, I see, right. So Philadelphia passes a measure in 1826, which actually the state of Pennsylvania passes a measure in 1826 called a personal liberty law. And one of its provisions is to dramatically increase the provisions to punish kidnappers. And commentary in other states says that those punishments are too draconian and barbaric and too severe. You've gone too far, Pennsylvania. That's part of it. But the other point I want to acknowledge here is that law doesn't just target kidnappers. It's a broad package of measures, one of which targets kidnappers, others of which target slave catchers and say, if you're a slave catcher after chasing someone who's come into Pennsylvania, then you're going to have to do a lot of paperwork before you can just drag out some black person, right? And Southerners say, slave catchers shouldn't have to do paperwork. They should be allowed to grab whomever they want and take them freely. So the criticism is about related measures in addition to kidnapping, if that clarifies things. Yep.
Hi. I'm curious about where that date of January 1, 1808 came from. Did I miss something?
I think you might have missed something. Yeah, it's written into the Constitution. It's the first date that you're allowed to abolish, regulate, do anything to the international slave trade.
Right, but where did they get that date from?
Oh, where did the framers get the date from? Oh, I missed that point. Yeah, I didn't explain that, so you missed nothing.
Oh, okay.
Let me tell you that part. The Constitution is written by human beings, all of whom are politicians. So it's the result of jockeying, right? In the first draft of that clause, Southern delegates have been pushing for a clause guaranteeing the preservation of the transatlantic slave trade for a certain number of years, right? They see that as a big win for them, and one of the things they're going to insist upon if Northern delegates want them to sign this document at the end of the day, right? It's a deal breaker for them that they get some protection for the international slave trade written into the Constitution. And so it happens to be a bunch of South Carolinians who write that particular clause, and one guy whose name I've forgotten writes the first draft and says, the United States can't get out of that business, Congress can't touch that business or regulate it until January the 1st, 1800. And he chooses 1800 because it's a nice round number. There's no other reason than that, right? 1800. And then another South Carolinian comes along and he sort of drives a harder bargain and says, okay, well, actually we don't think 1800 is long enough. That's only really 12 years from when this thing will be ratified. Wouldn't a rounder number be 20 years from when this thing is ratified? So if we get this thing ratified in, say, 1788, wouldn't 1808 be a nice round number? And by such, negotiations, the date of non-interference is pushed another 8 years into the future. That's how it happens. Yeah. And that guy's name is Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
I was curious, on the reverse Underground Railroad, did they have safe houses? Or I don't know if you know from
Safe
the
for
record.
whom? Safe for whom, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or were they out just in the woods, or where were they keeping people on these really long
Yeah,
journeys?
so I hesitate to put the map back up because the screen's disappeared. But if you remember, I showed you two maps. One was a sort of regional map of our region, then there was a national map. Think about the regional map. It had Philadelphia in the top right, then it had the Delmarva Peninsula in it, right? And you saw that they passed through that peninsula, and I said that they stop for a couple of weeks in a place near the Nanticoke River down in southern Delaware, Maryland area. And that's just not just because they were tired. It's because that's where this gang owned real estate. This gang, I didn't say much about the gang, so let me say a couple of things here. This gang is called the Cannon-Johnson Gang. It's one of dozens of gangs who do this work. The Cannon in that Cannon-Johnson is Patty Cannon, who, if you live on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, there's a good chance you've heard of today. She's still quite famous on that side of the bridge, but largely unknown on this side of the bridge. And the Cannon-Johnson gang owned two houses right on the Delaware-Maryland line. According to legend, one house was literally on the line, so if a sheriff from Delaware came knocking on the front door, the kidnappers would just go to the back door, which would be in Maryland. That's horseshit, but it's a good story, right? But they did own two pieces of property, both very close to the line. And so very simply, that's where they would use their own houses as sort of as a slave pen, as a place to collect and detain free people they had kidnapped from Philadelphia, from Baltimore, from rural Delaware, from rural Maryland, and they would gather people there. When a sheriff did actually come knocking in 1819, he found more than 20 black people incarcerated there. And he couldn't be sure, but he thought all of them were kidnapped, right, rather than legally bought. And the goal was to find an interstate slave trader who would be happy to buy these obviously kidnapped free people, but for a price where he wouldn't make too much of a fuss about it, and then he would carry them to Mississippi. That's usually what happened. But in this particular case, they can't find a buyer. It's not really interesting why, but they can't find a buyer. So after 2 weeks of these safe houses on the Delaware-Maryland line, this gang makes the relatively unusual decision to carry them themselves down to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. And so it's a gang members who are with them on that soul-destroying journey towards Mississippi and Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And it's gang members that these 5 boys are trying their damnedest to escape from over the next several weeks and months.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You talked about the impact in the South in the Haitian Revolution. But it's also not well known the impact in Mexico of the abolition in 1837. And there's another route to freedom going south and going to Mexico. And of course, the border, Mexican-American border, is going to change considerably in 1848 with the Mexican-American War. Do you know of any cases of kidnappings from Mexico to the United States, to southern states, or trying to capture these fugitives that went to Mexico?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on that, but you're absolutely right about all the facts you gave there. So I'm going to do something very brief and very pointed, which is to say there is a great book on this. I'm hoping some of you have already seen it. It's called South to Freedom. So check that out. That will have all the answers to that and more. And if you, it's written by a terrific historian that won a bunch of prizes. South to Freedom. And it's about the Underground Railroad, or freedom seeking in directions which aren't north. We always think of the Underground Railroad as running from the south to the north, which in a lot of ways is true. But it doesn't mean that's the only direction of freedom seeking. We can find enslaved people throughout the history of British America running literally south from places like Georgia and South Carolina into Spanish Florida, which is interesting because slavery was legal in Spanish Florida, but Spain had also put out the message that if any enslaved people from British America run to Spanish Florida, then those fugitives will be free when they get there. This is a way to stick it to the British. You can see that, right? It's not an anti-slavery commitment, it's a stick it to the British guy. So that happens to Spanish Florida, and it also happens heading westwards, as you correctly point out, into Mexico. And Mexico, I think, abolishes slavery in the 1837, thank you very much indeed. So it becomes an increasingly desirable destination for freedom seekers from places like Texas, like Tennessee, etc. So we need to get away from that old dichotomy of thinking about the Underground Railroad as solely people from Maryland going to places like Pennsylvania. That's true, but it's not the only story of the Underground Railroad. And if we had better documents, we might be able to say that maybe it's not even the largest freedom migration in this period. Thanks for the question. But South to Freedom is the book if you want to learn more. I think there's someone also over here as well.
I'm also glad that you mentioned the Haitian Revolution. I'm just making a comment because I think it's relevant. But I'm descended from a free African American who was born in Washington, D.C. and moved to Haiti in 1861. Mm-hmm. And I've always identified as Haitian American. I had no idea that I had roots in Maryland. And during the pandemic, I learned that they were from St. Mary's County and had been free, but really were leaving because of the threat of being free during those years as well. And they decided that Haiti would be where they could explore their freedom or exercise their freedom.
And that's a really useful reminder. I hope you all heard that, folks. So for white people who own human beings, Haiti is a terrifying place, an example of what America must never become, right? We can't let what happened in Haiti ever happen here. A successful slave revolt? No, we must tamp down every opportunity that enslaved people have to get free. We must pass newer, tougher laws every year to stop the possibility of a slave revolt. But for black Americans, especially free black Americans, Haiti is this beacon of post-slavery equality after the Haitian Revolution. It's a symbol of what's possible for a nation, that the slavery doesn't have to exist forever, that a different path forward is possible. And so many leading figures in the African American community, from Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, to Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, are often thinking the fundamental question, do we stay here and put up with more of this, or do we go somewhere else? And on the days when they're thinking about going somewhere else, Haiti's often at the very top of their list, and migration to Haiti is a real thing throughout that period. Yeah.
Thank you. Wasn't there like a free black community in Florida founded by Francisco Menendez? Even though he has a Spanish name, but he's actually African. I think the fort was called Fort Mose.
I'm glad you were going for the word. I was trying to think what that phrase was.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fort Mose, M-O-S-E, I think it is.
There's a documentary on Amazon Prime on it.
If you remember the name of the documentary, shout it out. There's also a new book about that community by Matt Clavin, C-L-A-V-I-N. There's also work by Jane Landers, L-A-N-D-E-R-S, who I think teaches at Vanderbilt, on that community as well. So that's one of the places where runaways from British American slavery who've made it to the border, who are granted their freedom by the Spanish crown, set up lives as free people. And again, it's not because Spain are the good guys. The European powers are rarely the good guys in any of these stories, but it is a byproduct of their rivalries, and enslaved people are willing to take full advantage of that possibility. So it's a fascinating community, and there are other communities of free people in very unusual circumstances all across North America. If you've never heard of the Maroons, then Google the Maroons after this. These are communities of formerly enslaved people who've run away not to cities, but to the woods and to the swamps, and set up their own communities in the swamps where they'll never be harassed by white people in urban areas again. So there's all sorts of communities of freedom on the edges of the normal story.
Yeah, I had a question. I probably don't need the mic, but I was curious to hear, because I have heard of Patty Cannon.
You have?
Over in Delaware, and the story that I heard was so horrible that, and you must have, if the gang that your book is about was connected to them, you may have heard of this story, but apparently Patty would pretend to be a gracious host to if they heard of people moving kidnapped people through the area, she'd say, well, I have an inn, you can stay here, we'll look after you, and then would serve dinner with poison and kill them just so they could seize these captives. And that made me think that if you're comparing and contrasting the reverse to the Underground Railroad, obviously the Underground Railroad is built on trust and communication and all this stuff, and yet the Cannons, like, nobody would trust them because they kill people to steal because they could get away with it. Have you heard that they did this?
So I have heard exactly the same stories you just offered about Patty Cannon, but I can tell you something you may not know is that all of those stories come from one place. They come from a pamphlet, I'm going to get the title wrong, published in 1841 in Delaware, 12 years after Patty Cannon died, and that pamphlet is sensational nonsense. It's designed to titillate you, to shock you and scandalize you, and so it did, and it worked, and it got endlessly reprinted, and most stories you hear about Patty Cannon come from that pack of lies. Patty Cannon was a terrible person who did terrible things, very few of them accurately described in that pamphlet. But it's
you must have gone to Delaware to research this book.
Oh yeah, to be sure.
And this kind of digging, if you want to say something about that, because I'm just trying to imagine how buried all the facts were.
So this is absolutely right. So you have to get past a lot of mythology, a lot of, actually, frankly, romanticization about this completely evil person. Still today, you can find things named after Patty Cannon in Delaware. There are friends of mine who were on a sort of racial task force in Baltimore, and one of the things they've tried to do, having read the book, is find anything named after Patty Cannon and ask someone to change the name. And they've succeeded in doing that several times in recent years, and they're continuing to do that. But there are roads, there are historic markers. There's a museum in, I think, the town of, I want to say, Seaford in Delaware, where there's an animatronic sort of dummy of Patty Cannon rocking back and forth on a rocking chair and cackling like she's a Halloween attraction. And that's the same sort of mythology that they're leaning into there, right? Like they got the Jack the Ripper over there, in the same way London, uses that mass murderer to drive tourist dollars. Whereas, the real history of Patty Cannon, I think, is much more shocking and sobering and should never be sort of romanticized in that. in that way. So you do have to peel back a lot of that stuff. And so I ended up, in land records, in taxation records, in endless legal documents from the handful of times that members of her gang got caught in some fashion. The sad news is, however, that this gang was very good at their jobs, and this gang is one of the most long-lasting and busy and energetic gangs of kidnappers anywhere in the United States. Most gangs are terrible at this work, and they get caught after, a couple of botched tries. This gang learns from its mistakes and gets better and better at it. It exists for at least 15 years, is responsible for, I think I can prove this, hundreds of kidnappings, and it's just one gang. There are plenty of others. And so Patty Cannon's name in her own lifetime becomes a name that free black people within, a 100-mile area have all heard because they warn each other about this gang who they think of as the Patty Cannon gang. And that name, Patty Cannon, is well known enough that we know that Frederick Douglass knew who Patty Cannon was. We know that Harriet Tubman knew who Patty Cannon was, and I would wager $100 that she was well enough known during her own lifetime as a kidnapper of free black people that the current president of the US back then, I think it was John Quincy Adams, would have heard that name at some point as well. That's the level of her notoriety. And remember, free black families in cities like Philadelphia, they are well aware that there are kidnappers roaming these streets. And the adults take every precaution that they can, which is one of the reasons why adults are so rarely kidnapped from cities like Philly. But their kids are a different story. And so the adults have to constantly tell their kids to be on the lookout, to not talk to strangers, don't go to certain parts of town, don't believe offers that are too good to be true. And the adults have to institute primitive forms of, a neighborhood watch where they get organized and they pool resources so that someone's always looking out for the kids on your block, because you don't know when someone from Patty's gang or one of these other gangs is going to take a chance. So that organized vigilance is one of the main roots of the organized anti-slavery movement in this country. So it's incredibly important. A couple behind you, just so you know.
You mentioned Haiti as an escape or as a model of freedom. Can you say anything about Liberia when that came?
Yeah, I'll do this quickly because I feel like we're probably running out of time here. So Haiti is this beacon. Now, Haiti is not perfect. It's not perfect then, it's not perfect now, but it's a beacon of what's possible nevertheless. And it's not the only beacon. There are at least three others that embattled African Americans think about. One is British Canada. After 1834, Canada is a place where slavery is illegal, and so Canada becomes a preferred destination for fugitives or for free black Americans who can't take it anymore in this country, Canada. But then there's two others, Liberia and Sierra Leone, both places on the west coast of Africa. Sierra Leone set up by the British in 1787, I want to say, as a place for poor white people from England and runaway slaves from the Revolutionary War can go and try to build something new. It's not a great success story, but it's an experiment in, post-slavery, post-racial democracy. And almost right next door, modeled on Sierra Leone, is the American equivalent, founded by private citizens in the United States, called Liberia, which means land of liberty. The capital is Monrovia, which is named after President James Monroe at the time. And it too is marketed to free black Americans in the US as a place where you can go if you can't take it anymore. And it's especially marketed to people who were enslaved until 10 minutes ago, but might have been freed by their owners or might have run away, or the laws might have changed in their state. If you don't think you're going to make it as a free person here, why don't you get on this boat? And on the one hand, it's exciting to have these new opportunities, these new possibilities. On the other hand, many scholars will tell you that the people who set up the Liberia colony in particular are wolves in sheep's clothing. That they're people, many of whom who own slaves themselves, who see Liberia as a place to draw off the free black population so that the only black people left in America are enslaved. So if you're black and you're in this country, your place is in slavery. Because if you're free and black, you should have left by now. So that debate about whether Liberia is a golden prospect or a ruse to be resisted is a very vibrant debate within the African American community for like 40 years.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Could you address if girls were also taken, and also a little bit about the age range of the people who are kidnapped? And you also said something about the prices in different places, that the cost of purchasing a slave. If you could address any of that, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I'll try and do that very briefly because I could say a lot about that. So first of all, I've chosen in this presentation to focus on the 5 boys in the title of my book. 2 adult women are also forced to make this journey along with them. And so if you read the book, you'll learn all about their experiences and how they got swept into this as well. We can also say that young girls frequently got swept up by other gangs or by this gang on other occasions. It just so happens there are no young girls in this story, but if I'd chosen another story, it might well have had young girls at its center, because that happened all the time too. There is great demand for young girls in the Deep South. If you think about cotton as a crop, cotton does not require massive amounts of hulking, muscular strength to harvest. What it requires is endurance and digital dexterity with your fingers. And it turns out, and planters figure this out, that the ideal demographic of a cotton picker is a 13-year-old girl. And so they seek large numbers of 13-year-old girls, either from legal sources or from completely illegal sources, like the ones I described today. So there's great demand for young girls. If you remember the movie 12 Years a Slave, you remember that was the big sort of North American debut of Lupita Nyong'o, who's now a big movie star, right? She played a woman called Patsy, who was a real person. Patsy actually existed, like Solomon Northup did. And the real Patsy was purchased by Edwin Epps at the age of 13, and was indeed the most valuable cotton picker on that plantation. And if you remember the movie, you know that Patsy is also the victim of incredible sexual exploitation at the hands of Edwin Epps, played by Michael Fassbender, which is a reflection of the very real threat to the sexual dignity of every enslaved woman in American slavery, girls most especially. And we know that slave traders buying enslaved people from Maryland and shipping them south. And we know that kidnappers, like the gang I described today, would happily grab young girls, knowing that they could violate them on the journey south themselves, and then sell them at a premium for repeated a lifetime of sexual assault. These are called fancy maids. They'll be advertised in local newspapers as a new fancy maid I've got for sale. And they would command you would see a premium based on how physically desirable they were considered to be by the people trying to sell them for the purposes of sex work. So this story has been much documented by historians. As to the prices, I could go on and on. All I will say is that kidnappers often make their money by undercutting the price of legally sold slaves. But of course, kidnappers haven't paid for that person in the first place, so they can go lower on price than people who've paid $400 in Maryland and then resell at $600 in New Orleans. So the economic dimensions of this are also interesting, but it's the human side of this that has always animated me most of all. Thanks very much indeed, everyone. I've got some books up the front if you want to see them.
Thank you all for coming. And yeah, if you want to talk to Richard, buy a book up front, and then out in the lobby, if you didn't sign up for our weekly e-newsletter, feel free to do that for news about all our events. Thanks.